The flash bulbs were a volley of silent thunder, and John Smith soaked them in his hand possessively on the bare, silk-clad back of the woman beside him. Her name was Amber, and she was not his wife. He was the king of New York tonight, the master of his universe, and she was his chosen queen. Across town, Irina Smith adjusted the diamond clasp on a necklace that had been in her family for generations, a cold, determined smile touching her lips. She knew exactly where her husband was and who he was with. What John didn't know was that the empire he was flaunting was never his to begin with, and the woman he'd discarded was about to reclaim her kingdom in front of the entire world. The Smith penthouse on Park Avenue was a monument to success, a silent testament to John's ambition. Its floor-to-ceiling windows offered a god's-eye view of Manhattan, a sprawling kingdom of glittering lights that on nights like this, John felt he owned. The air was sterile, conditioned to a perfect 72 degrees, and smelled faintly of lemon oil and John's self-satisfaction. For Irina Vance Smith, however, it smelled of loneliness. For 10 years, she had been the perfect wife. She'd curated their home into a feature for Architectural Digest, hosted flawless dinner parties for board members, and stood smiling by John's side as he accepted awards for being a titan of industry. He was the CEO of Vance Smith Industries, a sprawling conglomerate specializing in luxury real estate and tech investments. He was the public face, the charismatic deal maker. She was the silent partner, the elegant accessory. At least that's how he saw her. The illusion had been fraying for years, the silken threads of their marriage snapping one by one. It began with the late nights he dismissed as closing deals, the calls he'd take in the other room, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. It grew with the casual cruelty, the way he'd correct her in front of friends or mock the literature degree she'd earned before they met. "My Ellie," he'd say with a patronizing chuckle, "she lives in a world of poetry and fairy tales. I handle the real world." Tonight, the final thread was about to be severed. The Metropolitan Benefactors Gala was the crown jewel of the New York social season. It was an event sponsored in large part by Vance Smith Industries. It was the one night of the year John was expected to shine brightest with his beautiful wife on his arm. He had strolled into her dressing room an hour ago, not even bothering to loosen the Tom Ford tie he'd knotted with practiced ease. He smelled of expensive cologne and a lie he hadn't even bothered to construct properly. "Darling," he began, the endearment sounding like an insult. "There's been a last-minute change of plans." Irina was sitting at her vanity, the soft glow of the mirror lights illuminating the quiet resignation in her eyes. She met his gaze in the reflection. "Oh, an investor. A huge one from Dubai. He's skittish. Wants a one-on-one tonight. I have to go to the gala alone, press the flesh, make him feel secure. It's business, you understand." He ran a hand through his perfectly coiffed dark hair. "It's a dreadful bore. You'd hate it. Better you stay home, relax. Read one of your books." Irina's fingers tightened around a silver-backed brush. For a decade she had accepted these flimsy excuses. She had swallowed her pride, quelled her suspicions, and played the part of the understanding, supportive wife. She had done it because she loved the man he once was, or the man she thought he was. The charming, ambitious man who had pursued her relentlessly, swearing he loved her for her mind and her quiet strength, not just the Vance family name. But that man was gone, replaced by this arrogant stranger who thought she was a fool. She turned from the mirror to face him, forcing a placid smile. "Of course, John. I understand completely. Business comes first. He beamed, his relief palpable. He didn't see the ice forming in her blue eyes. He only saw compliance. "That's my girl. I knew you'd get it." He leaned down and kissed her cheek, a dry, dismissive peck. "Don't wait up." And with that, he was gone. The heavy oak door of her dressing room clicked shut, and the silence that followed was deafening. Irina stood up, her movements fluid and deliberate. She walked over to the window, looking down at the river of yellow cabs and black cars flowing through the concrete canyons below. He thought she was a fool. He thought she was weak. He thought she was just another one of his assets, a beautiful piece of property to be housed in his penthouse. He had forgotten who she was. He had forgotten that before she was a Smith, she was a Vance. And the Vances did not build empires by being fools. A single cold tear traced a path down her cheek, but it wasn't a tear of sadness. It was a tear of rage. The cage, gilded as it was, had become a prison, and tonight she was not just going to escape. She was going to burn it to the ground. She picked up her phone, her thumb hovering over a number she hadn't dialed in years. It was time to call in the architect of the entire Vance legacy. The seed of suspicion had been planted months ago, a tiny bitter thing that Irina had tried to ignore. It was a receipt, a simple slip of paper that had fallen from John's coat pocket. It was from a little-known but ridiculously expensive lingerie boutique in Soho called Fleur Secrète. The purchase was for a silk and lace set in a size far smaller than her own, and a bottle of perfume she didn't wear. The date on the receipt corresponded with a night he'd claimed to be in a grueling all-night negotiation with a firm from Tokyo. At the time, she'd convinced herself it was a gift for a client's wife. A business courtesy. It was easier to believe a comforting lie than to confront a devastating truth. But after John left for the gala, the lie crumbled into dust. The cold certainty she felt wasn't just intuition. It was a conclusion built on 100 other tiny betrayals. She went to his study, a room that was more of a shrine to himself than an office. Diplomas, awards, and framed magazine covers featuring his face lined the mahogany walls. She ran her hand along his cold, imposing desk, her mind racing. He was arrogant, but he was also careless. Arrogance bred carelessness. Her fingers found a small, almost invisible indentation on the underside of the desk. A hidden latch. Years ago he'd shown it to her, boasting about his little James Bond secret. Inside was a small, velvet-lined compartment where he kept a spare watch and a few other personal items. And tucked beneath them a second phone. A burner phone. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she powered it on. It was locked, of course. But John's ego was his greatest weakness. The password was his birthday. Too simple. She tried his Man of the Year award date. Nothing. Then she tried the stock ticker symbol for Vance Smith Industries, VCI. The phone unlocked. The irony was so bitter it almost made her laugh. The symbol of the company her family had built was the key to unlocking his deceit. The message history was a sickening chronicle of his affair. The recipient was saved under the initial A, on my way, wearing the red dress. You'll be the only one I see tonight. John. I can't wait. Tonight everyone will see who the real queen is. A is your wife going, John. Please. I told her I had a business meeting. She bought it as usual. She'll be at home reading her dusty old books. The name Amber appeared in an earlier text, a confirmation for a dinner reservation. Amber Collins. Irina's blood ran cold. She knew the name. Amber was a junior marketing executive at the company, known more for her ambition and her flirtatious demeanor at company parties than for her professional acumen. She was young, beautiful, and utterly transparent in her goals. The messages went back months. Lavish gifts, secret trips to the Caribbean, promises of a future together once John handled the situation with his wife. He referred to Irina as a formality, a relic of a past business arrangement. He had reduced their 10-year marriage to a contractual obligation he was eager to terminate. The personal betrayal was a physical blow, leaving her breathless. But as she scrolled further, a different kind of anger began to smolder. Interspersed with the sordid messages were discussions about the company. John just leveraged the Aspen property for the new acquisition. The board is too old and slow to see the genius of it. They only see risk. Amber. You're a visionary, John. They're holding you back. John. Once Ellie is out of the picture, her family's influence on the board will be gone. I can finally run this company the way it's meant to be run. No more looking over my shoulder. He wasn't just cheating on her. He was gambling with her family's legacy. Vance Industries had been founded by her grandfather and built into a powerhouse by her father, Anthony Vance. It was built on principles of stability, integrity, and long-term vision. John's talk of leverage and risk was the opposite of everything her father stood for. He was treating the company like his personal casino. The pain in her chest crystallized into something hard and sharp resolve. This was no longer just about a broken heart. It was about saving the work of generations from the reckless ego of the man she had once loved. She put the phone back, wiping it clean of her fingerprints. She walked calmly to her own office, a bright, airy room filled with the books John so openly disdained. She unlocked a drawer in her desk and pulled out a thick, leather-bound folder. The documents inside were old, the paper soft with age. It was the original incorporation charter for Vance Industries and the shareholder agreement from when it merged with a smaller firm to become Vance Smith. Most importantly, it contained the papers for the private family trust her father had established years ago. She had read them countless times, but this time she read them with new eyes. John was the CEO. He had significant shares, yes, a generous gift upon their marriage. But he was, in essence, an employee, a highly paid, powerful manager. The controlling interest, a staggering 51% of the voting shares, was held not by her father, but by the Vance family trust. And the sole beneficiary and trustee of that trust upon her 30th birthday, 5 years ago, had become Irina Vance Smith. John had forgotten this. Or perhaps in his hubris, he had come to believe his own myth that he, through sheer force of will, was the majority owner. He had grown comfortable believing her to be passive and uninterested in the real world. He had mistaken her quiet nature for weakness. That was about to be the most costly mistake of his life. She picked up her phone again and dialed the number she had hesitated over earlier. It rang 3 times before a familiar, gravelly voice answered. "Irina, father." She said her own voice, steady and clear, betraying none of the turmoil inside her. "I need your help. I'm coming to see you, right now." The helicopter ride north was a blur of city lights, giving way to the dark, sleeping suburbs. Then the dense blackness of the forests of upstate New York. Irina barely noticed. She sat staring out at the void, the damning text messages burning in her mind. The rhythmic whoomp, whoomp, whoomp of the rotor blades was a war drum counting down the hours until her old life was utterly demolished, and a new one began. Anthony Vance had retired from the world a decade ago, shortly after Irina's marriage. After a lifetime spent building an empire and a minor health scare that served as a major wake-up call, he had retreated to a sprawling estate in the Adirondacks. He called it the Eyrie. It was a fortress of stone and glass built into the side of a mountain, accessible only by a winding private road or by air. He had traded boardrooms for libraries and stock tickers for trout streams. He rarely came to the city, and he never, ever interfered in the running of the company he had passed on. He had trusted John to be a worthy steward, both for his company and for his daughter. The helicopter landed on a private helipad lit by soft, glowing markers. A rugged-looking man in a flannel jacket was waiting to escort her to the main house. The air was crisp and smelled of pine and cold stone. It was a world away from the perfumed, polluted air of Manhattan. Anthony was waiting for her in his study. The room was vast, with a 2-story wall of books on one side and a massive stone fireplace on the other, where a log fire crackled and spat. He was not the titan of industry she remembered from her childhood. Age had softened his features, and his once jet-black hair was now a distinguished silver. But his eyes, the same piercing blue as hers, were as sharp and intelligent as ever. He stood as she entered his expression, a mixture of concern and curiosity. "Irina," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You look pale. What's happened?" She didn't waste time with pleasantries. She walked to the large oak desk in the center of the room and laid out her evidence like a prosecutor. She placed the burner phone on the polished wood. She had taken pictures of the key messages and printed them. She then produced the financial reports she'd had her personal accountant quietly pull, highlighting the leveraged properties and the high-risk ventures John had undertaken without full board disclosure. "John is having an affair," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "With an employee. Tonight he took her to the benefactor's gala. He lied to me, and he is humiliating me. That I can handle. But he is also destroying your company, Father. He's gambling with our legacy, using it as his personal piggy bank to fund his ego." Anthony was silent for a long time. He picked up the printed messages, his brow furrowed. He read Amber's fawning praise and John's arrogant dismissals of his wife and board. He then moved to the financial reports, his eyes scanning the numbers with the practiced ease of a man who had spent a lifetime reading balance sheets. A muscle in his jaw twitched. The quiet retiree vanished, and in his place was the lion who had dominated Wall Street for 40 years. The boy always had more ambition than sense, Anthony said, his voice dangerously quiet. "I thought you would temper that. I thought your marriage would ground him." "He thinks I'm a fool," Irina replied, her voice cracking for the first time. "He thinks I'm a decorative object with no understanding of the real world. He forgot where the money came from. He forgot whose name is on the door." "No," Anthony corrected, his gaze locking with hers. "He forgot whose name is on the trust. He forgot who holds the power." He walked to the window, looking out into the impenetrable darkness of the mountain night. "When your mother died, I promised I would protect you. Part of that was letting you live your own life, make your own choices, even your own mistakes." I stepped back. I gave him rope, believing he would build a ladder, not a noose. He turned back to her, his eyes blazing. "He has disrespected my company. He has disrespected my legacy. But worst of all, he has disrespected my daughter. That is a transgression I will not tolerate." The plan began to form in that room by the crackling fire, a strategy devised by 2 generations of Vance ingenuity. It was audacious, public, and utterly ruthless. It was a plan designed not just to remove John, but to annihilate his reputation so completely that he would never work in this town again. "What do you need me to do?" Irina asked, her strength returning, fortified by her father's fury. First, Anthony said, a grim smile touching his lips. "You need to change. That dress is for a victim. You are going to a coronation, not a funeral. Go upstairs. Your mother's gowns are still in her closet. Find the one she called her armor." While Irina went upstairs, Anthony made 2 calls. The first was to Marcus Thorne, the family's lawyer for 50 years, a man whose loyalty to the Vances was absolute. He instructed him to prepare an injunction and the paperwork for an emergency board meeting. The second call was to the head of security at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, a man who owed Anthony a significant favor. An hour later, Irina descended the grand staircase. She had found the dress. It was a couture gown of deep crimson silk that her mother had worn to the White House years ago. It was elegant, powerful, and utterly breathtaking. With her hair swept up and her family's diamonds at her neck, she was no longer John Smith's discarded wife. She was Irina Vance, daughter of Anthony Vance, and the true owner of an empire. Anthony looked at her, and for a moment the fierce businessman was replaced by a proud father. "Perfect," he breathed. "He won't know what hit him." He offered her his arm. "Shall we, my dear? It's been a long time since I've attended a party. I believe it's time to remind New York society who the Vances are." The grand hall of the Metropolitan Museum of Art was a glittering sea of power and influence. Crystal chandeliers, each the size of a small car, cast a golden glow over the city's elite. Senators rubbed shoulders with tech billionaires, and celebrated artists chatted with silver-haired doyens of old society. The air itself seemed to hum with the collective energy of 1,000 egos, all vying for attention, for validation, for a moment in the spotlight. And tonight, the spotlight belonged to John Smith. He stood near the base of the grand staircase, a flute of champagne in one hand, the other resting proprietorially on Amber Collins's waist. She was a vision in a daring red dress, the one she'd texted him about. It was cut low in the front and high on the thigh, a stark, screaming contrast to Irina's classic and understated elegance. Amber was fire loud and bright, and John was using her to signal his own virility and power. He was holding court. People gravitated towards him, drawn by the magnetic pull of his success. He was the CEO of Vance Smith, the primary sponsor of the evening and the man of the hour. He laughed a deep, confident sound that echoed in the cavernous hall. He introduced Amber not as his mistress, but with a carefully chosen ambiguous title. "This is Amber Collins," he announced to a cluster of admirers, including the influential gossip columnist Beatrice Fairfax. "My brilliant protégée. She's the future of our marketing division. A real rising star." Amber preened under the attention, her smile wide and predatory. She looked at the faces around her, the Astors, the Vanderbilts, the new money titans, and saw her own reflection in their envious eyes. She had done it. She had clawed her way out of obscurity and into the absolute center of power. She was on the arm of the most important man in the room. The meek, boring wife was a distant memory, a footnote in the story of her glorious ascent. Whispers followed them as they moved through the room. "Isn't he married?" a woman murmured behind her fan. To Anthony Vance's daughter, her companion replied, the quiet one. Dreadfully dull, I hear. Well, this one is anything but dull. Look at that dress. You could floss with that thing. The gossip only fueled John's arrogance. He enjoyed the scandal. It made him feel virile, powerful, a man who took what he wanted. He believed he had insulated himself so thoroughly within the company, made himself so indispensable, that he was untouchable. Irina, with her gentle nature and her lack of interest in business, posed no threat. The board was composed of old men who were dazzled by the company's recent and risky profit margins. He was the king, and this gala was his coronation ball. He caught the eye of Beatrice Fairfax, the columnist, who was watching him with a shrewd, calculating gaze. He gave her a conspiratorial wink. He was feeding the beast, creating the narrative himself. The story would be about the dynamic CEO and his brilliant new star, a changing of the guard. Mr. Smith, Beatrice said, her voice smooth as silk, but with an edge of steel. A bold move coming with Ms. Collins tonight. Whereas Irina John's smile didn't falter. My wife is feeling a bit under the weather. She sends her regrets. She insisted I come and represent the company, and that I bring my most promising executive with me. Irina is all about fostering new talent. It was a masterful lie delivered with such casual confidence that it was almost believable. Amber squeezed his arm, her eyes shining with adoration. He was powerful, charming, and utterly in control. The evening's host, the museum director, tapped a glass for attention. Ladies and gentlemen, if I may have your attention, in a few moments we will be hearing from the man whose incredible generosity has made this evening possible. He is a visionary leader, a pillar of our community, and a true titan of industry. Please prepare a warm welcome for the CEO of Vance Smith Industries, Mr. John Smith. A ripple of applause went through the room. This was it, the apex of his career. John straightened his bow tie, gave Amber a quick, triumphant kiss, and began to make his way towards the stage set up at the foot of the staircase. He felt 1,000 pairs of eyes on him. He felt like a god ascending Olympus. He was so blinded by the spotlight, so deafened by the applause, that he didn't notice the sudden collective intake of breath from the crowd near the main entrance. He didn't see the whispers turn from speculation to stunned silence. He didn't see the sea of faces part as two figures made their way through the throng. He was just 2 steps from the stage, his victory speech already on his lips, when the great oak doors at the far end of the hall swung fully open and a hush fell over the entire gala. The silence was so profound, so sudden, that it was more powerful than any noise. John stopped confused. He turned, following the gaze of every single person in the room, and his world stopped turning. The silence in the grand hall was a physical thing, a heavy blanket that smothered all sound. The clinking of glasses, the murmur of conversation, the soft strains of the string quartet. It all vanished, sucked into a vacuum of collective shock. Every head was turned towards the grand entrance, where 2 figures stood, silhouetted against the bright lights of the foyer. As they stepped forward into the warm glow of the hall, the gasps began. They were quiet at first, little ripples of disbelief, but they quickly grew into a tidal wave of astonished whispers that swept through the crowd. It was Irina, but it was not the Irina anyone knew. Gone was the quiet, conservatively dressed society wife who faded into the background. In her place stood a queen. She wore a gown of crimson silk that seemed to drink the light, a stark, regal statement against the sea of black tuxedos and pastel dresses. The Vance diamonds glittered at her throat, not as mere ornaments, but as armor. Her posture was erect, her shoulders back, her chin held high. Her face, which John had so often called pleasantly plain, was transformed by a look of cold, unshakable resolve. She was incandescent with a fury so pure it was beautiful. But it wasn't just Irina's transformation that had stolen the breath of New York's high society. It was the man on whose arm she leaned. He was older, with a mane of silver hair, and a face etched with the lines of a life lived at the highest levels of power. He moved with a quiet authority that needed no announcement. He wore a simple, perfectly tailored tuxedo, but he may as well have been wearing coronation robes. He was a myth, a legend, a ghost from the golden age of Wall Street. It was Anthony Vance. For a decade, he had been a recluse, a name spoken in hushed, reverent tones. Most of the younger people in the room had never even seen him in person. But the older generation, the real power brokers, recognized him instantly. They were the ones who had witnessed his genius, who had feared his ruthlessness, and who had respected his absolute integrity. His presence here tonight was the equivalent of a king returning from exile. John stood frozen halfway to the stage. His mind simply couldn't process what his eyes were seeing. Irina here, looking like that, and with her father. It was impossible. Anthony never came to the city. He hated these events. And Irina. She was supposed to be at home reading a book, blissfully unaware. Amber, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, tightened her grip on John's arm. "Who is that?" she whispered, her voice laced with unease. "Why is everyone staring?" John couldn't answer. His mouth was dry, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He saw Beatrice Fairfax, the columnist, her eyes wide, a wolfish grin spreading across her face. She was smelling the biggest society story of the decade. Irina and Anthony moved through the parted crowd with regal slowness. They didn't look at anyone. Their eyes were fixed on one target, John. Every step they took was a judgment. Every meter they crossed was another nail in his coffin. The crowd, sensing a confrontation of epic proportions, instinctively backed away, creating a wide, clear path between the entrance and the stage like an executioner's lane. As they drew closer, John could see Irina's eyes. The warm, forgiving blue he knew was gone. In its place was a glacial ice, a chilling emptiness that promised no mercy. The placid, accommodating woman he had married was gone. In her place was a stranger, a Vance, and she was looking at him not with the pain of a betrayed wife, but with the cold contempt of a CEO looking at an underperforming asset about to be liquidated. Anthony's gaze was even more terrifying. It was the look of a creator surveying a flawed creation just before he smashes it to pieces. There was no anger, no passion, just a profound, quiet disappointment that was somehow infinitely worse. They stopped a few feet from John and Amber. The silence stretched, becoming unbearable. The entire social and financial elite of New York was holding its breath, waiting. Finally, Anthony spoke. His voice was not loud, but it carried the weight of his legacy, cutting through the silence and reaching every corner of the vast hall. He didn't look at John. He looked past him towards the museum director, who was still standing dumbfounded on the stage. "I believe Anthony Vance," said his voice as cold and clear as a winter morning, "that there has been a mistake in the evening's program. Mr. Smith will not be speaking tonight." John's blood turned to ice water in his veins. Anthony Vance's words, spoken so calmly, were not a request. They were a decree. The world tilted on its axis, the glittering ballroom seeming to warp and bend around him. He finally found his voice, a strangled, incredulous croak. "Anthony," "Irina, what is the meaning of this? What are you doing here?" He forced a laugh, a hollow, desperate sound. "Trying to surprise me." "Well, you've certainly done that." He turned to the crowd, trying to reclaim control to frame this as a bizarre family prank. "My father-in-law, ladies and gentlemen, always one for a dramatic entrance." No one laughed. No one even smiled. They were watching a public execution, and they were mesmerized. Anthony took a deliberate step forward. He addressed the crowd, now his voice resonating with an authority John could only ever imitate. "Good evening. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Anthony Vance. I founded the company that generously sponsored this wonderful event tonight. I have been retired for 10 years, content to leave the running of my life's work in what I believed were capable hands." His eyes finally settled on John, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "It has come to my attention," Anthony continued, "that my faith was misplaced. Vance Smith Industries was built on a foundation of integrity, stability, and fiduciary responsibility. Recently, under the leadership of Mr. Smith, the company has engaged in a series of reckless, highly leveraged acquisitions that have put the entire enterprise at risk. He has done so without the full, transparent approval of the board, and more importantly, without the approval of the majority shareholder." A collective gasp went through the room. Majority shareholder. Everyone thought John was the one in charge. John's face went white. "Now just a minute," he sputtered, taking a step towards Anthony. "That's privileged company information. This is not the time or the place. This is precisely the time and the place." Irina's voice cut in sharp and clear as shattered glass. It was the first time she had spoken, and the sound of her voice, so full of command, stunned John into silence. She glided past her father to stand directly in front of John and Amber. She looked at Amber, her eyes sweeping over the cheap shock of the red dress and the desperate ambition in the younger woman's face. There was no jealousy in her gaze, only a sort of weary pity. "Miss Collins," Irina said, her voice dangerously soft. "You are the rising star, I presume. The brilliant protégé." She let the words hang in the air, dripping with sarcasm. "You hitched your wagon to a man who promised you a kingdom. I feel it's my duty to inform you that you've been riding with a court jester who was merely allowed to sit on the throne for a while." Amber paled, her triumphant smile dissolving into a mask of horror and confusion. She looked at John, her eyes silently begging him to fix this, to reassert the power she had found so intoxicating. But John was speechless, floundering. Irina turned her full attention to her husband. "You thought I was a fool, John. You thought I was content to live in your shadow, oblivious, while you played with my family's money and slept with your subordinates. You mistook my patience for weakness. You mistook my silence for ignorance." She took a step closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was somehow audible to everyone in the silent hall. "Let me be very clear. You are the CEO, a title, an employee. I am the majority shareholder, the owner. The Vance Family Trust, of which I am the sole trustee, controls 51% of this company. Your reign is over." From the edge of the crowd, a man in a dark suit stepped forward. It was Marcus Thorne, the Vance family lawyer. He handed a folder to the museum's head of security, who then approached John. Mr. Smith, the security head, said, his voice formal and unsympathetic, "You are being served with a court injunction barring you from entering any Vance Smith property, effective immediately, There will be an emergency board meeting tomorrow at 9 a.m. to vote on your termination for cause." John stared at the papers as if they were written in a dead language. His empire, his identity, his entire world had been dismantled in less than 5 minutes in front of everyone who mattered. His face, which had been a mask of arrogant confidence, crumbled. He looked around wildly, seeking an ally, a friendly face, but all he saw was a mixture of pity, morbid curiosity, and thinly veiled schadenfreude. He turned to Irina, his eyes pleading. "Ellie, please, we can talk about this at home. Don't do this." Irina looked at him, and for the first time a flicker of emotion crossed her face. It was not love, not even hatred. It was a profound and final indifference. "There is no home anymore, John," she said. "And my name is Irina Vance." She turned her back on him. Anthony took the microphone from the podium on the stage. "My apologies for the interruption," he announced to the stunned audience. "Please enjoy the rest of your evening." Vance Smith. Industries is now under new management. Stable management. And I am pleased to announce that the board will be voting to appoint its new interim chairwoman tomorrow morning. My daughter Irina Vance. The finality of it was absolute. John Smith was no longer just a cheating husband. He was a footnote. A publicly disgraced unemployed footnote. His gaze fell on Amber, who was already backing away, disentangling herself from him, as if he were radioactive. Her dream had become a nightmare. She had attached herself to a falling star, and she was about to be crushed in the impact. Without a word, she turned and fled. Disappearing into the shocked crowd, her red dress a final pathetic flash of her failed ambitions. John stood alone, bathed in the spotlight he had so craved, utterly and completely destroyed. The chaos that erupted after Anthony Vance's announcement was immediate and overwhelming. The Gala, once a bastion of decorum, descended into a frantic buzz of gossip. Cell phones emerged, thumbs flying across screens, as the city's elite raced to be the first to break the most spectacular social and corporate implosion in a generation. John remained frozen for a moment longer, a statue of ruin in the center of the storm. Then the head of security touched his elbow. "Sir, I have to ask you to leave." The touch, though gentle, was firm. It broke the spell. John's face contorted in a mask of pure rage and humiliation. He looked at Irina's back as she stood calmly beside her father, accepting quiet congratulations from a few old family friends who were now rushing to her side. He opened his mouth to shout, to curse, to deny, but no words came out. He was a king without a kingdom, a voice without power. Flanked by 2 security guards, he was escorted out through a side door, not as a titan of industry, but as a trespasser. Irina did not watch him go. Her past was being swept out with the trash. Her focus was on the future. The rest of the evening was a blur of handshakes, murmurs of support, and looks of newfound respect. People who had barely acknowledged her for a decade now clamored for her attention. She was no longer John's quiet wife. She was the power in the room, the new sun around which they all suddenly orbited. The following morning, the news was everywhere. The Wall Street Journal ran the headline, "Vance returns. Heir apparent ousts CEO Croft in dramatic coup." Beatrice Fairfax's column was even more direct. "Gala of the damned Crofts' reign ends in public humiliation." The stories detailed John's affair, his reckless business dealings, and the stunning revelation of Irina's true position. The 9 a.m. board meeting was a formality. The board members, who had been cowed by John's aggressive style, fell in line immediately under the steely gaze of Anthony Vance, who attended via video conference. The vote to terminate John was unanimous. The vote to install Irina Vance as interim chairwoman was also unanimous. When the meeting was over, Irina walked down the hallway to the corner office. The large, ostentatious brass plate on the door still read, "John Smith, Chief Executive Officer." She ran her fingers over the letters, then looked at the building's head of maintenance, who stood waiting with a toolbox. "Please have this removed," she said calmly. "Immediately." She pushed the doors open and stepped inside. The office was just like the rest of John's life, a monument to his own ego. A massive, imposing desk dominated the space. The walls were covered with photos of him shaking hands with politicians, grinning on sailboats and accepting awards. His scent, that arrogant, expensive cologne, still lingered in the air. For a moment she felt a pang of something. Not sadness, but a strange sense of loss for the woman she had been. The naive young woman who had believed in fairy tales, who had loved a man that never truly existed. She had been weak, trusting, and complacent. That woman had died last night. Irina walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows, the same view she had from her penthouse prison. But from here, it felt different. It was not a gilded cage. It was a kingdom. Her kingdom. She looked down at the bustling streets of Manhattan, the arteries of commerce and power, and felt not fear or inadequacy, but a surge of profound, invigorating purpose. She spent the rest of the day in a whirlwind of meetings with lawyers, department heads, and accountants. She was decisive, intelligent, and utterly in command. The years she had spent quietly reading, observing, and learning the very things John had mocked had prepared her for this moment. She absorbed complex financial data, asked insightful questions, and laid out a clear, concise plan to stabilize the company and undo the damage John had caused. The staff, who had lived in fear of John's volatile temper, looked at her with a mixture of awe and relief. Late in the afternoon, her father called. "How does the chair feel?" he asked, a rare note of humor in his voice. "A little large," Irina admitted, a small smile touching her lips. "But I think I'll grow into it." "I have no doubt," Anthony said, his voice thick with pride. "Your mother would have been so proud, Irina. You are truly a Vance." After she hung up, she sat in the deepening twilight, the city lights beginning to twinkle to life below. She was no longer Mrs. John Smith. She was not even just Anthony Vance's daughter. She was Irina Vance, the chairwoman of Vance Smith Industries. She had been tested by the deepest betrayal, and instead of breaking, she had been forged into steel. Her revenge was not just in taking John's job, it was in being brilliant at it. Her triumph was not just in winning, but in reclaiming herself. The road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time in a decade, it was her own. And she was ready to walk it. The St. Regis Hotel suite was by any measure a pinnacle of luxury. Gilded fixtures gleamed, the bed was the size of a small country, and a bottle of complimentary champagne sat sweating in a silver bucket. For John Smith, it was a prison. He had stumbled here in the early hours of the morning, his mind a chaotic whirlwind of fury and disbelief. He'd been on his phone ever since a general trying to rally an army that had already deserted. His first call was to his lawyer, a man who had been on his payroll for a decade. The response was clinical. "John, I'm sorry. My primary duty is to the corporation. Given the circumstances and the clear instructions from the majority shareholder representing you would be a catastrophic conflict of interest. You'll need to find new counsel." The line went dead. He tried the board members one by one. Men he had golfed with whose backs he had slapped at expensive dinners. Most didn't answer. The one who did, a senior director named George Matheson, was brief. "You brought this on yourself, son. You played with Anthony Vance's money, and you humiliated his daughter. There's no coming back from that. Lose my number." Desperation clawed at him. He scrolled through his contacts, his thumb hovering over Amber's name. He called. The call didn't even ring. It went straight to a recorded message. "The number you have dialed has blocked incoming calls from your number." Blocked. The woman who had sworn he was a visionary, who had looked at him with doe-eyed adoration just 24 hours ago, had already cut him loose. She was a cockroach scurrying from the light, and he had been a fool to think her loyalty was to him and not to the power he wielded. He threw the phone across the room, where it hit the silk-papered wall with a pathetic thud. He was utterly, completely alone. The power he thought he possessed, the loyalty he thought he commanded, it was all an illusion. It had never been his. It was rented, borrowed from the Vance name, and his lease had been terminated in the most public way imaginable. The silence of the hotel room was deafening, broken only by the frantic, panicked thumping of his own heart. He was John Smith, but without the title, without the company, the name meant nothing. He was a ghost haunting a life that was no longer his. Meanwhile, 40 blocks south, Irina Vance was not haunting an old life. She was building a new one. She arrived at the Vance-Smith building at 7 a.m. sharp, not in a chauffeured town car, but in a taxi. She wanted to walk through the front doors on her own 2 feet. The office was already buzzing with the news, and as she walked through the lobby, a hush fell. People stared, their faces a mixture of awe and apprehension. She offered a small, professional smile and a nod, her calm demeanor, a stark contrast to the chaos of the previous night. Her first order of business was to meet with the head of human resources. Ms. Vance, the woman, a stern but fair executive named Carol, began. "Regarding Amber Collins, her employment is to be terminated." Irina stated, her voice even. "For gross misconduct and a violation of the company's fraternization policy. Offer her the standard severance. Have security escort her from the building. No drama, no spectacle. We've had enough of that. We are a place of business, not a tabloid." Carol nodded, visibly relieved. "Understood, ma'am." Irina's command was absolute, but it wasn't tyrannical. It was efficient. She spent the morning in back-to-back meetings, methodically untangling the web of high-risk deals John had initiated. She discovered he had leveraged company assets to near breaking point to fund a vanity project, a speculative tech venture with no clear path to profitability. He had been playing roulette with her family's legacy. With each document she reviewed, her resolve hardened. This was no longer about personal betrayal. It was a rescue mission. Around noon, her assistant buzzed. "Ma'am, it's a Mr. Smith on your private line. He's been calling repeatedly. I told him you were unavailable." Irina held up a hand. "It's all right, Maria. Put him through." She leaned back in her new leather chair, a chair that fit her perfectly, and picked up the receiver. "What do you want, John?" she asked, her tone flat. His voice came through the line, a ragged, desperate sound she barely recognized. "Ellie, thank God. Ellie, you can't do this. We need to talk. This is insane." "There is nothing to talk about," she replied calmly. "The board has voted. The injunction is in place. It's over. Over 10 years of marriage over. Just like that. Because of one mistake," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "You're destroying my life. Our life over a moment of weakness." Irina almost laughed. A moment. It was 100 moments, 1,000 lies. Our life was a fiction, you wrote, John. And your mistake was not the affair. Your mistake was believing I was a fool. Your mistake was gambling with my father's company. This is not an emotional decision. This is a business decision. Business, he spat, the desperation turning to his old familiar venom. You don't know the first thing about business. You're a librarian in a ball gown. You'll run Vance Smith into the ground in 6 months. There it was, the sneering condescension she had lived with for a decade. But now it had no power over her. It was the impotent snarling of a caged animal. That is a risk the majority shareholder is willing to take, she said, her voice as cold as steel. Goodbye, Mr. Smith. Do not contact me again. Any further communication will be through our respective lawyers. I believe you are in the process of finding one. She hung up the phone before he could reply, the click of the receiver, a final, definitive end. She did not feel sorrow. She did not feel anger. She felt quiet, a profound and peaceful quiet. The nagging background noise of John's ego, which had dominated her life for so long, was finally gone. She stood and walked to the vast window looking down at the city. It was her city now. The empire was hers to command. The ashes of her old life, of her marriage, were behind her. From them, she would build something stronger, something more honest, something that was entirely her own. She was no longer a wife, an accessory, or a secret. She was Irina Vance, and she was just getting started. Irina's story is a powerful reminder that the quietest person in the room is often the most formidable. She endured betrayal, not with tears, but with strategy, turning her deepest pain into her greatest source of power. She didn't just get even. She got everything. By reclaiming her family's legacy, she reclaimed her own life, proving that a person's worth is never determined by who they stand beside, but by the strength with which they stand on their own. It's a testament to the fact that you can never underestimate a woman who has finally decided to fight for herself. What did you think of John's epic downfall and Irina's triumphant rise? Let us know your favorite part of her revenge in the comments below. If you loved this story of empowerment and justice, please show your support by hitting that like button, sharing it with someone who needs a dose of inspiration, and subscribing for more unforgettable tales. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you never miss a single story of a queen reclaiming her throne. The anonymous email landed in my inbox at 2:17 a.m. The subject line was just 2 words, St. Jude's. Inside there was no text, only a link. A link to a video that would detonate my life. It was raw, grainy security footage from the maternity ward of the very hospital where my husband Michael had supposedly mourned the loss of our stillborn son just 3 weeks earlier. But the video didn't show a grieving father. It showed a man I barely recognized, his face etched, not with sorrow, but with a chilling, frantic energy. And the woman he was, with her hand clutching his. That woman wasn't me. They say the truth sets you free. But as I watched that footage, all I felt was the cold, hard reality of a lie so monstrous it would unravel not just a marriage, but the very fabric of who I thought we were. My world, the one I had so meticulously curated, was painted in shades of beige and pottery barn. It was a world of scented candles, Sunday brunches, and the soft cashmere-wrapped dream of impending motherhood. Michael and I were that couple, the ones whose Christmas cards made other people vaguely resentful. He was a successful architect, all sharp lines and even sharper suits, with a smile that could disarm a hostile boardroom. I was a freelance graphic designer, a profession that allowed me the flexibility to nest, to obsess over paint swatches for the nursery, and to scroll endlessly through baby name forums. Our life in our sprawling suburban home just outside of Austin, Texas, was a testament to shared ambition, and I thought shared love. We'd met in college, a whirlwind romance that had settled into the comfortable rhythm of a decade-long marriage. We'd weathered his demanding career, my brief but intense flirtation with opening a bakery, and the quiet, creeping anxiety of trying for a baby. When the 2 pink lines finally appeared on the pregnancy test, it felt less like a surprise and more like a hard-won victory. Michael had wept. He'd dropped to his knees and pressed his ear to my still flat stomach, whispering promises to our unborn child. He was an exemplary, expectant father. He assembled the crib with an engineer's precision, attended every Lamaze class, and learned to expertly massage my swollen ankles. He'd talk to my belly for hours, telling our son, whom we'd already named Caleb, about the world he was about to enter. The pregnancy was, for the most part, idyllic. I'd lean into the stereotype craving pickles and ice cream, and Michael would dutifully make midnight runs to the 24-hour grocery store. Our friends Mark and Sarah, who had 2 boisterous toddlers of their own, would watch us with a knowing, almost pitying fondness. "Just you wait," Mark would chuckle, ruffling Michael's hair. "Sleep now. You'll thank me later." The first fissure in our perfect world appeared so subtly, I almost missed it. It was a Tuesday afternoon, about a month before my due date. Michael called, his voice strained. "Sweetheart, I have to fly out to Chicago. A last-minute thing with the Harrison project. A major investor is threatening to pull out." Chicago now. I'd asked, a knot of disappointment tightening in my chest. We had a birthing class that evening. "I know, I'm so sorry, Amelia. I wouldn't go if it wasn't a 5-alarm fire. I'll be back Thursday, I promise. I love you. I love you both." He was so convincing, so genuinely apologetic, that I'd pushed my unease aside. It was his job. It was our future. But then, a few days after he was supposed to have returned, I was scrolling through Instagram. A girl I'd gone to college with, a bubbly blonde named Chloe Jenkins, who now worked in PR in Chicago, had posted a story. A picture of a crowded, trendy cocktail bar, the kind with Edison bulbs and artisanal gin, and there in the background, unmistakable even in the blurry periphery, was Michael. He was laughing, his head tilted back, a drink in his hand. He wasn't in a suit. He was wearing a casual Henley, the one I always said brought out the blue in his eyes. And his arm was draped casually around the shoulders of a striking redhead I'd never seen before. My blood ran cold. I took a screenshot, my fingers trembling. When I confronted him, showing him the picture, he didn't even flinch. He looked at me with those earnest blue eyes and laughed. A short, dismissive sound. "Amy, sweetheart, you're seeing things. That's not even me." "Michael, I know what you look like. It's a blurry photo. It's some guy who looks like me." "And Chloe? You know, she's always been a bit of a drama queen. Probably just trying to stir something up." He pulled me into a hug, stroking my hair. "You're hormonal, baby. It's okay. I was in meetings the entire time. I was miserable. I missed you and Caleb every second." He was so good. So plausible. He showed me his expense reports. A string of Uber rides to a bland corporate office park, a dinner for one at a generic steakhouse. He had an answer for everything. I wanted to believe him. The alternative was a chasm I wasn't ready to face. So I let it go. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the stress of the impending birth was making me irrational. I deleted the screenshot. I apologized. And I tucked the incident away in a dark corner of my mind, a place I refused to visit. 2 weeks later, I went into labor. It was premature, a full 3 weeks early, but the doctors at St. Jude's Medical Center weren't overly concerned. The contractions came hard and fast. Michael was by my side, a rock. He held my hand. He breathed with me. He whispered encouragement. He was the perfect husband, the perfect father-to-be. The hours blurred into a haze of pain and fear. There were complications. The baby's heart rate was dropping. The calm, reassuring voices of the nurses started to take on a sharper edge. The room filled with more people. I remember the anesthesiologist's kind eyes, the cold sting of the epidural. I remember the doctor, a woman with a stern but compassionate face, saying, "We need to get him out now." Then nothing. A black, empty void. I woke up in a quiet, dimly lit room. The first thing I noticed was the silence. The rhythmic beeping of the monitors was gone. The bustling energy of the labor ward had been replaced by a heavy, oppressive stillness. Michael was slumped in a chair by my bed, his face buried in his hands. His shoulders were shaking. "Michael?" My voice was a dry, raspy whisper. He looked up, and his face broke me. It was a mask of utter devastation. His eyes were red-rimmed and hollow. Tears streamed down his cheeks unheeded. "He's gone, Amy." He choked out, his voice thick with a grief so profound it seemed to suck the air from the room. "Caleb, he didn't make it." The words didn't compute. They were just sounds, meaningless syllables that my brain refused to assemble into a coherent thought. I looked down at my body, at the flat expanse of my stomach beneath the thin hospital blanket. The life that had been there, the kicks and flutters that had become the rhythm of my days, was gone. The doctor came in and explained it in gentle clinical terms. Placental abruption, a rare catastrophic event. There was nothing anyone could have done. It was no one's fault. They were so sorry for my loss. The days that followed were a blur of unimaginable pain. I was a ghost, haunting the corridors of my own life. The nursery, once a room of joyful anticipation, became a mausoleum. Every tiny onesie, every perfectly folded blanket was a dagger to my heart. Michael was my shadow, my keeper. He handled everything. The hospital paperwork, the funeral arrangements, a small private service that I was too sedated to fully comprehend. He fielded the calls from concerned friends and family. He held me when I woke up screaming in the night. He seemed to be drowning in his own sea of grief. He lost weight. Dark circles appeared under his eyes. He'd sit for hours in the rocking chair in the nursery, just staring at the empty crib. He was the very picture of a bereaved father, and I clung to him. His grief was the only thing that validated my own. We were in this together, two shipwrecked survivors on a desolate shore. Our shared loss was the fragile raft that kept us afloat. I needed his pain to be as real as mine. It was the only thing that made sense in a world that had suddenly cruelly stopped making sense. The lie was perfect. It was seamless, comprehensive, and utterly devastatingly believable. He had built a fortress of sorrow around us, and I, his willing prisoner, had never once thought to check if the walls were real. The first 3 weeks after we lost Caleb were a suffocating fog. Time became a fluid, meaningless concept marked only by the rising and setting of the sun, which I mostly observed from the cocoon of my bed. Michael was my constant, my warden of grief. He brought me meals I didn't eat, coaxed me into showers I didn't want, and filled the silence with a steady stream of soothing, empty words. "We'll get through this, Amy. He'll always be our son. I love you so much." His performance was flawless. He never missed a beat. When my mother came to stay for a week, her own face a mirror of my sorrow, she'd watch Michael with tear-filled eyes. "You're a good man, Michael," she'd whispered to him in the kitchen one afternoon, a moment I overheard from the top of the stairs. "Thank God Amelia has you." He'd even begun to channel his grief into a project. He announced one evening, his voice heavy but resolute, that he was designing a memorial garden for the hospital, a place for parents like us. He'd said, his gaze distant, a place to remember the children we never got to hold. He'd spend hours at his drafting table, sketching intricate plans for fountains and benches and flower beds. It was all so noble, so heartbreakingly poignant. But grief is a strange and unpredictable beast. In its initial all-consuming phase, it blinds you. But as the raw, visceral agony begins to recede even slightly, a new kind of clarity can emerge. Your senses, dulled by shock, slowly begin to sharpen. You start to notice things, small things, inconsistencies. The first crack was small, almost imperceptible. It was a bill, an itemized statement from the hospital. I'd found it in the mail which Michael had taken to sorting through before I saw it, to protect you from any unnecessary stress, he'd said. This one had apparently slipped through his filtration system. I scanned the list of charges, a morbid curiosity compelling me to relive the trauma in black and white. Anesthesia, operating room fees, pharmacy, and then a line item that made me pause. NICU, level 3 care, 3 days. NICU, neonatal intensive care unit. I frowned. Why would Caleb have been in the NICU? The doctor had been clear. It was a stillbirth. He was gone before he was born. There was no care, intensive or otherwise. I assumed it was a clerical error, a common enough occurrence in the bureaucratic labyrinth of healthcare. But the detail lodged itself in my mind, a tiny burr under the skin. The second crack appeared a few days later. Sarah, my best friend, came over bearing a casserole and a bottle of wine she knew I wouldn't drink. She sat with me on the couch, letting the silence hang comfortably between us, before she finally spoke. "How are you really?" she asked, her voice gentle. I gave her my standard, non-committal answer. "Getting by." She nodded, her eyes full of a sympathy that for the first time felt a little off. There was something else there, a hesitation, a flicker of pity. No, that wasn't it. It was something closer to discomfort. "Amy," she began, choosing her words carefully. "When Michael called us from the hospital, he was a wreck. Mark and we wanted to come right away, but Michael was so insistent. He said you didn't want to see anyone, that you needed space." "I did," I said, my voice barely a whisper. I couldn't face anyone." "I get that," she said quickly. "Of course I do." But he said something else. Something odd. I waited, my body tensing. "He said that they had Caleb on life support," she said, her brow furrowed in confusion. "He said you were both just waiting, making a decision. He was asking Mark about what that was like to let go." The casserole on my lap suddenly felt like a lead weight. Life support, A decision. This was a narrative I hadn't heard, a version of the story that diverged wildly from the one I had been told. He must have been confused. I said the words, tasting like ash in my mouth. He was in shock. We all were. Of course, Sarah said immediately, backing down, sensing my distress. That must be it. Oh, Amy, I'm so sorry. I shouldn't have even brought it up. It's just... it stuck with me. But it stuck with me, too. It joined the NICU charge, another piece of a puzzle I didn't know I was solving. That night I couldn't sleep. The image of Michael on the phone with Mark, fabricating a story about our son on life support, played on a loop in my head. Why? Why would he lie about something so specific, so sacred? Was his grief so profound it had created false memories? Or was it something else? The memory of the Instagram photo from Chicago, the one I had so willingly dismissed, resurfaced with a vengeance. The laughing man with his arm around the redhead. You're hormonal, baby. It's some guy who looks like me. My hands started to tremble. I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Michael, who was sleeping soundly, a picture of peaceful exhaustion. I tiptoed into his home office, the room where he was designing his memorial garden, a sanctuary of his supposed sorrow. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the silent house. I didn't know what I was looking for. I just knew I had to look. His laptop was closed on his desk. I opened it. It was password protected, of course. I tried our anniversary. Nothing. I tried my birthday. Nothing. I tried Caleb. The screen unlocked. A wave of nausea washed over me, using our dead son's name as a password. The thought was both sickening and, in a twisted way, perfectly in character with the grieving father he was pretending to be. His email was already open. I felt a pang of guilt, a lifetime of respecting his privacy, warring with the gnawing suspicion that was now consuming me. I clicked on his sent folder. There were emails to contractors about the memorial garden, emails to his colleagues, thanking them for their condolences. And then I saw it. A thread of emails with a woman named Jenna. Jenna Reed. My breath hitched. The redhead from the Instagram photo. The emails went back months. They started professionally enough, something about a joint project between his firm and hers in Chicago. But the tone quickly shifted. They became familiar, flirty, intimate. They talked about meeting for drinks for dinner. They talked about her recent divorce. They talked about how alive he felt when he was with her. I scrolled down, my vision blurring with tears. The dates were a brutal chronological indictment. There was an email from the day he'd supposedly flown to Chicago for his 5-alarm fire meeting. From Michael Davenport to Jenna Reed. Subject: on my way, wheels up. Can't wait to see you. Counting the minutes. Ditch the boring conference dinner tonight. I found a place I think you'll love. And then I found the emails from the week Caleb had died. He'd been emailing her from the hospital, while I was in labor, while I was in surgery, while I was lying in a drugged haze, believing he was by my side, drowning in grief. From Michael Davenport to Jenna Reed. Subject: it's happening. Amelia's in labor. It's early. This is it. Talk soon. Then a few hours later. From Michael Davenport to Jenna Reed. Subject: it's happening. It's a nightmare here. Complications. Don't know what's going on. I'll call you when I can. And then the email that made me physically recoil, a gasp escaping my lips. It was sent the morning after I'd been told our son was gone. From Michael Davenport to Jenna Reed. Subject: I need you. It's over. He didn't make it. It's for the best. I know we talked about this, the timing. It would have been impossible, but God, Jenna, it's still... I can't explain it. She's a mess. I have to be the strong one here. I have to play the part. But all I can think about is you. All I want is to be with you. This whole thing, it just makes me realize I can't live this lie anymore. As soon as I can, I'm coming to you. It's for the best. The timing. It would have been impossible. I have to play the part. The words swam before my eyes. The fortress he had built crumbled around me, and I saw the lie for what it was. It wasn't about shared grief. It was about an affair. It was about an exit strategy. The death of our son wasn't a tragedy he was enduring with me. It was a complication he was managing. A messy, loose end he needed to tie up so he could move on to his new life, his new woman. The NICU charge. The story about life support to Sarah and Mark. It all clicked into place with sickening clarity. These weren't the ramblings of a grief-stricken mind. They were lies. Scaffolding to support a bigger, more monstrous lie. He needed a story that was dramatic, that required his constant attention, that isolated me, and made him the heroic, grieving husband. A story that bought him time. My grief, which had been a raw, open wound, was suddenly eclipsed by a rage so white-hot, it was almost dizzying. The man sleeping in my bed, the man whose tears I had wiped away, the man whose hand I had clung to, as if it were a lifeline, was a stranger, a monster. I closed the laptop, my movements stiff and robotic. I walked out of the office and back into our bedroom. I stood by the bed, looking down at his sleeping face. He looked so peaceful, so innocent, and I felt a chilling, terrifying calm settle over me. The fog had lifted, and in its place was a cold, hard certainty. I didn't know what the full truth was, but I was going to find out. And I was going to burn his world to the ground. It was in this state of cold fury in the dead of night, fueled by betrayal and a desperate need for irrefutable proof, that I did something I never would have imagined myself capable of. I thought about the hospital, St. Jude's, a place of immense pain, but also a place with answers. I thought about the inconsistencies, the lies. And I thought about the one thing that doesn't lie. Cameras. I sent an anonymous email to a local investigative journalist, a woman named Isabella Rossi, whose work I'd followed, known for her tenacity in uncovering institutional malfeasance. And then I sent another one from a different burner account to a victims' rights group that specialized in medical negligence. I didn't know what would come of it, but I had planted a seed. I had lit a match. Now all I could do was wait for the explosion. It came a week later in the form of that 2:17 a.m. email. The one with the subject line, St. Jude's. The one with the link that would change everything. I clicked it, and my world went from a nightmare into a living hell. The video player loaded a stark white box against the dark screen of my laptop. There was no sound, just the silent, unblinking eye of a security camera. The timestamp in the corner read 8:14 p.m. on the day Caleb died. The angle was from high in a corner, looking down on a section of a hospital corridor. It was unmistakably St. Jude's. The same pale green walls, the same polished linoleum floors I had stared at in a daze. The sign on the wall was blurry, but I could make out the letters NICU. My heart hammered against my ribs. This is it. A nurse in blue scrubs walked briskly past the camera. A doctor followed a moment later. Then from the left of the frame, Michael appeared. My Michael. He was wearing the same dark grey sweater I'd laid out for him that morning. But the man on the screen was not the devastated husband-to-be I remembered. His posture was rigid, his movements jerky and agitated. He was pacing, running a hand through his hair, his phone pressed to his ear. He looked trapped, cornered. He stopped pacing and leaned against the wall directly under the camera. He was talking animatedly, his free hand gesturing in frustration. I couldn't hear the words, but I could read the panic in his body language. This was not a man waiting for news about his laboring wife. This was a man trying to control a situation that was spiraling out of his grasp. Then from the right of the frame she appeared. Jenna Reed. The redhead from the Instagram photo, the name in the emails. In the flesh. She was wearing a chic black coat, looking utterly out of place in the sterile hospital environment. She walked directly to Michael, her face a mixture of concern and impatience. I watched my breath caught in my throat as she reached him. She put a hand on his arm. He immediately flinched, pulling away, shaking his head and glancing nervously down the hallway in the direction of my delivery room. He said something to her, his expression hard and dismissive. She recoiled, her own face hardening. They began to argue, a silent, frantic pantomime of rage and recrimination. She jabbed a finger at his chest. He grabbed her wrist. She tried to pull away. It was ugly, vicious, a scene not of shared comfort, but of a clandestine meeting gone horribly wrong. This wasn't a friend offering support. This was a confrontation. And then the most damning moment of all. A doctor, the same stern-faced woman who had delivered the news of Caleb's death to me, walked towards them from the direction of the NICU. She had a clipboard in her hand. She approached Michael, her expression grave. Michael's entire demeanor shifted. The anger vanished, replaced instantly by a mask of gut-wrenching sorrow. He physically crumpled, leaning his head against the wall, covering his face with his hands. It was a performance, a switch flipped. Jenna stood by her arms crossed, watching him with a look of cold, calculating assessment. The doctor spoke to Michael for a few moments, her hand on his shoulder in a gesture of compassion. She pointed back towards the NICU. Michael shook his head vehemently. The doctor spoke again, her expression turning from sympathy to something more insistent. She seemed to be urging him towards the unit. He refused again, more forcefully this time, waving a hand dismissively. He said something that made the doctor's eyes widen in disbelief. Then she simply nodded, a look of profound sadness and perhaps a touch of disgust on her face, and walked away. Once the doctor was gone, Michael straightened up. The mask of grief fell away as quickly as it had appeared. He turned back to Jenna, his face a snarl of pure fury. He grabbed her by the arm and pulled her roughly down the corridor, away from the NICU, away from my room and out of the camera's frame. The video ended. I stared at the blank screen, the silence of the room roaring in my ears. The pieces didn't just fall into place. They slammed together with the force of a car crash. Caleb had been in the NICU. The bill was not a mistake. Sarah had not misheard. My son had been born alive. He had been alive, and he had been fighting for his life in a glass box just down the hall, and my husband, his father, had been in the corridor, arguing with his mistress. The doctor had tried to bring him to his son. She was urging him towards the unit, and he had refused. The lie was so much more monstrous than I could ever have conceived. He hadn't just lied about an affair. He hadn't just lied about the timing of Caleb's death to make his getaway easier. He had lied about our son's entire existence. He had let me believe our child was stillborn, a silent, painless tragedy, when in reality Caleb had lived. He had breathed, and he had died alone without his mother while his father refused to even go see him. Why? The answer was right there in the video, in the cold, hard expression on Jenna Reed's face, in the frantic, trapped energy of my husband, a living, breathing baby, a premature baby who would require months of intensive care and a lifetime of devotion that was not part of their plan. It was the ultimate complication. A stillbirth was a tragedy you could mourn and move on from. A critically ill child was an anchor, a lifelong responsibility that would have chained Michael to me forever. So he made a choice. He chose his affair over his son. He rewrote the narrative. He turned our son's fight for life into a story of instantaneous death. He curated my grief, managed my reality, to fit his sordid escape plan. The rage that had been simmering inside me erupted into a volcanic inferno. It was a physical force, so powerful I thought it would tear me apart. I wanted to scream. I wanted to destroy something. I wanted to walk into the bedroom and wake him up, not with words, but with my bare hands. But then a different instinct took over, a cold, chilling calm. The same calm I'd felt when I'd decided to look at his laptop. This wasn't a private matter anymore. This wasn't a marital dispute to be settled with screaming matches and thrown pottery. He hadn't just betrayed me. He had committed an act of unimaginable cruelty against his own child. He had defrauded a hospital. He had lied to doctors. And he had enlisted his mistress as a co-conspirator. The leaked footage wasn't just my personal vindication. It was evidence. I forwarded the email with the video link to Isabella Rossi, the investigative journalist. My note was simple. This is security footage from St. Jude's Medical Center on the night of May 12th. The man in the video is Michael Davenport, a prominent Austin architect. He told his wife their son was stillborn. As you can see, that was a lie. Look into the NICU records. Look into Jenna Reed of Reed PR in Chicago. Look into the memorial garden he is currently fundraising for. He didn't just have an affair. He let his son die alone to save it. And then I forwarded it to the police. The story broke 2 days later. It wasn't just a local story. It went national. Isabella Rossi's article was a masterpiece of controlled fury, laying out the facts in stark, brutal detail. "The architect of a monstrous lie," the headline screamed. The article included stills from the security footage, Michael's face contorted in anger or Jenna's cold and watchful. It detailed the timeline, the emails, the hospital bill, the confirmation from anonymous sources at St. Jude's that baby boy Davenport had indeed spent 72 hours in the NICU before succumbing to complications of his premature birth. They had tried repeatedly to get the father to come and see the child, to authorize certain procedures, but he had been unreachable or unwilling to engage. The public response was instantaneous and savage. The story was a perfect storm of infidelity, betrayal, and the ultimate parental sin. Michael became a villain of almost cartoonish proportions overnight. His face was everywhere, on cable news, on tabloid websites, on social media feeds. The name Michael Davenport became synonymous with narcissistic cruelty. His firm fired him, issuing a public statement denouncing his deplorable and unethical personal conduct. The fundraising page for the memorial garden was taken down, but not before screenshots circulated online, a testament to his staggering hypocrisy. People found his social media, his firm's page, my own long-dormant accounts. The comments were a torrent of hatred. Monster. Psychopath. I hope he rots in hell. Jenna Reed was not spared. Her PR firm's website was flooded with one-star reviews. Her professional headshot was juxtaposed with the grainy security footage, still of her watching Michael's fake breakdown. She was branded the home-wrecking ghoul. Her career was incinerated in a matter of hours. I watched it all unfold from the guest room of Mark and Sarah's house. I had packed a single bag the morning after I saw the video and left before Michael woke up. I left my wedding ring on the pillow next to his head. I didn't leave a note. The entire world was about to leave him a note. My own role in the story was that of the tragic victim. The media painted me as the poor, grieving mother doubly betrayed by her monstrous husband. My photo, a smiling, pregnant shot from my Instagram, was splashed everywhere. I received an outpouring of sympathy from strangers around the world. It was surreal and strangely numbing. Their pity felt as distant and impersonal as their rage towards Michael. The only thing that felt real was the new agonizing truth about my son. Caleb. He had lived. He had a birth date and a death date. He had been a person in the world, however briefly. And this new knowledge brought with it a new kind of grief. It was sharper, more defined. I wasn't just mourning the loss of a dream anymore. I was mourning a real boy, a boy whose father had discarded him like a piece of trash. A few days after the story broke, Michael was arrested. The charge wasn't murder or anything as dramatic as the online mob wanted. It was fraud. He had knowingly provided false information to the hospital, leading them to misclassify the death and issue an incorrect death certificate. There were also questions about medical decisions that were delayed or not made because of his refusal to engage. It was a messy, complex legal situation, but for now, the fraud charge was enough to hold him. I saw his mugshot online. The handsome, charming architect was gone. In his place was a hollow-eyed, unshaven man with a haunted, terrified expression. He looked broken, but I felt nothing. No pity, no satisfaction, just a vast, cold emptiness. The unveiling was complete. The perfect life, the perfect husband, the perfect grief, it had all been a lie. And now the truth in all its ugly, brutal glory was out for the world to see. I had gotten the truth. I had gotten my revenge. But as I sat in that quiet guest room, surrounded by the wreckage of my life, I had to face the terrifying question of what came next. The world loves a good villain, and Michael Davenport was tailor-made for the role. The media frenzy was relentless, a piranha-like swarm that stripped every detail of our lives down to the bone. Our wedding photos holiday, snaps my baby shower pictures. They were all repurposed as exhibits in the public trial of my husband. Each smiling image was now imbued with a sinister irony. Look at the happy couple just months before he let their baby die. I remained sequestered at Mark and Sarah's, a voluntary prisoner in their suburban guest room. They were magnificent, acting as gatekeepers against the world. They fielded calls from reporters, deflected nosy neighbors, and kept me supplied with tea and tissues. Sarah would sit with me for hours, not pressing me to talk, just offering a solid, comforting presence against the tsunami of chaos. My grief for Caleb had transformed. The murky, undefined sorrow of losing a stillborn child was replaced by the sharp, specific agony of mourning a son I never knew. I requested the full medical records from St. Jude's. They arrived in a thick manila envelope, and I read them with a forensic intensity. I learned his weight, 3 pounds, 2 ounces. His length, 15 inches. I read the nurse's notes, their neat professional script detailing his every struggle. Infant exhibiting respiratory distress. Apnea episodes increasing in frequency. Attempts to contact father unsuccessful. These clinical details were both torture and a strange kind of solace. They made him real. He wasn't just a phantom kick in my belly. He was a tiny person who had fought. The knowledge was a knife in my heart, but it was a real knife, not the phantom pain I'd been living with. I was no longer grieving a possibility. I was grieving a person. And with that came a new, focused anger. Not just at Michael, but at myself. How had I not known? How could a mother not feel on some primal cellular level that her child was alive? The guilt was a heavy cloak suffocating me. Michael denied bail due to being a flight risk, and the sheer public outrage languished in county jail. His high-powered family in Connecticut hired a top-tier legal team led by a shark of a defense attorney named Marcus Thorne, who immediately went on the offensive. Thorne's strategy was clear paint Michael not as a monster, but as a man who had suffered a profound psychological break. Mr. Davenport was under unimaginable stress. Thorne declared on the courthouse steps, his voice oozing sincerity. The impending birth, the pressures of his career, and a marriage that was already quietly fracturing led to a dissociative episode. He created a false narrative, not out of malice, but because his mind simply could not cope with the reality of his son's critical condition. This is not a case of fraud. It's a case of profound mental trauma. It was a brilliant, insidious defense. It attempted to reclaim the narrative of grief that Michael himself had so expertly woven. I watched the press conference on TV, a bitter laugh escaping my lips. A psychological break. He hadn't had a break. He'd had a plan. The emails to Jenna were proof of that. Speaking of Jenna, she had vanished. Her social media was deleted, her firm's website was offline, and her office was shuttered. The press couldn't find her. But the police did. She was located in a luxury spa resort in Arizona, having fled Chicago the day the story broke. They brought her back to Austin for questioning. She was not charged with a crime, she had broken no laws, but she was a material witness, and facing the ruin of her career and the full force of public condemnation, she decided to save herself. She made a deal with the prosecutors for immunity in exchange for her testimony. Her deposition was leaked to the press, of course. Every sordid detail. She recounted how she and Michael had met, the thrill of their affair, their shared fantasy of a future together. And then she came to the part about the baby. According to Jenna, the pregnancy had been a crisis point. Michael had assured her he would leave me, but the baby complicated everything. Her version of events painted Michael as weak and indecisive a man, panicking as his carefully compartmentalized life began to converge. He told me the baby would trap him, her deposition read. He said that if the baby was born healthy, he'd never be able to leave. The guilt would be too much, the societal pressure too great. We were in the hotel in Chicago when Amelia went into labor. He was a mess. He kept saying, "This is a disaster. This ruins everything." The most chilling part of her testimony concerned the hours at the hospital. She admitted to going there to confront him, to demand he make a choice. And she described the moment he learned Caleb was alive, but critically ill. He came out of the delivery area, and his face was white, she stated. He said, "It's alive, but it's sick. They don't think it's going to make it." And then he looked at me, and I saw a look in his eye. It was cold, calculating. He said, this could be a way out, a clean break. He decided right then and there. He told me the plan he would tell Amelia the baby was stillborn. He said it would be kinder that way. A quick, tragic end, instead of weeks or months of false hope. He said it would let them grieve together, and then, when the time was right, they could go their separate ways. He said it was the only way to manage the situation without destroying everyone. Kinder. He had called this monstrous selfish deception an act of kindness. He had appointed himself the arbiter of my grief, the editor of my reality, to facilitate his escape into a new life. Jenna's testimony destroyed Marcus Thorne's psychological break defense. This wasn't a man unmoored from reality. This was a man executing a premeditated, cold-blooded plan. The fallout from Jenna's deposition was a second explosion ripping through what little was left of our social circle. People were forced to take sides. My side was easy: the wronged wife, the grieving mother. His was impossible. His friends, his colleagues, even some of his family publicly disavowed him. He was utterly alone. One evening, Mark came into the guest room, a grim look on his face. "You got a letter," he said, holding it out as if it were contaminated. "From him. It was sent here from his lawyer." I took it from him, my hand steady. I hadn't heard a single word from Michael since I'd left. No calls, no texts, no emails. Just the public pronouncements of his lawyer. I slit the envelope open. The letter was written on a piece of yellow legal paper, his familiar architectural script looking alien and obscene. "Amelia, I know you will never forgive me. I don't expect you to. I don't forgive myself." Listening to Thorne talk in court, listening to what Jenna said, it's like hearing about a stranger, a monster. I don't know who that man was. The pressure, the lies, it all just avalanched. I was suffocating and I made a choice. A terrible, unforgivable choice. I see his face now, Amy. The nurses at St. Jude's, they showed me a picture. After it was over. I wouldn't look at the time. I refused. But they put a photograph in my discharge file. I found it when I was looking for paperwork for Thorne. I've been looking at it every night here in my cell. He looked like you. He had your nose. I destroyed everything. I destroyed you. I destroyed our son. I destroyed myself. I know sorry is a pathetic, meaningless word. It's an insult. But it's the only one I have. Don't let this destroy you. Please. You are a good person. You deserved a good life, a good husband. You deserved to be Caleb's mother. And I stole that from you. Michael. I read the letter twice. There was no rage left in me. No fire. Just a profound, bone-deep weariness. His apology, his self-pity, his supposed realization, it was all too little too late. It was the pathetic whimper of a man who had been caught. He wasn't sorry for what he did. He was sorry for the consequences. He looked like you. He had your nose. The words were meant to be a bridge, a shared detail of our son. But all it did was highlight the chasm between us. He had a photograph, a picture of our son's face. And he had kept that from me, too. Another secret, another layer of his betrayal. I folded the letter neatly. I did not rip it up. I did not burn it. I placed it in the manila envelope with Caleb's medical records. It was just one more piece of evidence in the case file of my shattered life. The unraveling was almost complete. The lies had all been exposed. The villain had been caged, and the truth was a harsh, unforgiving glare. All that was left was the trial, and the daunting task of figuring out how to live in the scorched earth he had left behind. The trial of Michael Davenport was a spectacle. It felt less like a legal proceeding and more like the final act of a grim nationally televised play. I was there for every moment, a silent, black-clad figure in the front row. I refused to let the media's portrayal of me as a fragile, broken victim define me. I needed to bear witness. I owed it to Caleb. Michael, clad in an ill-fitting suit, looked like a ghost. The charm and confidence that had once been his armor were gone, replaced by a hollowed-out resignation. He rarely looked at me. When our eyes did meet across the courtroom, his were filled with a desperate, pleading shame. I felt nothing. It was like looking at a stranger. The prosecution, armed with the security footage, the emails and Jenna Reed's damning testimony, laid out their case with brutal efficiency. They painted a picture of a cold, narcissistic man who viewed his own child as a complication to be managed. They called nurses from St. Jude's to the stand who testified through tears about baby boy Davenport's fight for life and their frustrating, futile attempts to get his father involved. He told me on the phone, "There's no point in me coming down there. It's a foregone conclusion." One veteran NICU nurse testified, her voice thick with contempt. "I've been doing this for 30 years. I've seen parents in denial, in shock, in every state of grief imaginable. I have never, ever seen a parent so indifferent." The defense, hamstrung by Jenna's testimony, did their best to salvage the psychological break narrative, but it rang hollow. Marcus Thorne put a psychiatrist on the stand who spoke of narcissistic personality disorder and acute stress reactions. But under cross-examination, even he had to admit that Michael's actions, the meticulous lies, the cover-up, the manipulation of me demonstrated a high degree of planning and cognitive function, not a break from reality. The moment that will forever be seared into my memory was when the prosecution introduced the photograph of Caleb into evidence, the one Michael had mentioned in his letter. They had retrieved it from his files. An evidence technician projected it onto the large screens in the courtroom. And there he was, my son. He was so tiny, nestled in a tangle of wires and tubes. His skin was translucent, his eyes were closed, and his tiny chest was still. But he was beautiful. He was perfect. He had my nose, and a shock of dark hair, just like Michael's. A sound escaped my lips, a raw, guttural sob that I couldn't contain. The courtroom, which had been buzzing with whispers, fell utterly silent. In that moment, he was not baby boy Davenport, the tragic figure in a news story. He was Caleb, my Caleb, and the world was finally seeing him. I saw Michael crumple at the defendant's table, his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent, racking sobs. For the first time, his grief looked real, but it was a selfish grief. Grief for himself, for the life he'd lost, the man he'd failed to be. It had nothing to do with the tiny boy on the screen. The jury was out for less than 2 hours. The verdict was guilty. Guilty of felony fraud. Guilty of reckless endangerment. The judge, a stern, no-nonsense woman, delivered the sentence a week later. She spoke directly to Michael, her voice dripping with scorn. "You did not just lie, Mr. Davenport," she said, her eyes boring into him. "You constructed an alternate reality of unimaginable cruelty. You weaponized your wife's grief and love for you to cover your own pathetic infidelities. You treated the life and death of your own son as an inconvenience to be managed. Your crime is not just against the state or the hospital. It is a crime against humanity, against the very definition of fatherhood. It is one of the most profound acts of narcissistic cruelty I have ever witnessed from this bench. She sentenced him to the maximum possible term, 10 years in state prison. A gasp went through the courtroom. 10 years. It was a harsh sentence for fraud, but it was clear the judge was sentencing the moral crime, not just the legal one. I walked out of the courthouse into a sea of cameras and reporters. I didn't stop. I just kept walking, Mark and Sarah flanking me like bodyguards. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel vindicated. I just felt quiet. The noise that had been roaring in my head for months had finally subsided. It was over. The weeks and months that followed were a slow, painful process of rebuilding. I sold the house, the one with the beige walls, and the nursery that had become a mausoleum. I couldn't bear to be in it another second. I took my half of the assets and moved into a small, bright apartment in a different part of Austin, a part of the city that held no memories of him. I legally changed my last name back to my maiden name, Amelia Shelton. It was a small act, but a significant one. I was no longer Amelia Davenport. That woman, the one who believed in the Pottery Barn fantasy, was gone. She had died with Caleb. I started seeing a therapist who specialized in trauma and grief. We talked about Caleb. We talked about Michael. We talked about the complex, tangled knot of my own guilt and rage. She helped me understand that I couldn't have known that I was the victim of a master manipulator, and that my body and mind, under the trauma of childbirth and what I believed was catastrophic loss, had been in survival mode. I never spoke to Michael again. His lawyers reached out regarding the divorce proceedings, which were swift and uncontested. He signed everything, gave me everything I asked for. It was his final futile act of penance. I heard through the grapevine that Jenna Reed had moved to another state, changed her name, and was attempting to start over forever, branded by her association with the case. I found I didn't have the energy to hate her. She was just another piece of wreckage in the blast zone of Michael's lies. My life now is quiet. It is small. I still work as a graphic designer, but I find my greatest solace in volunteering at a local animal shelter. The uncomplicated, unconditional affection of the abandoned dogs and cats is a balm to my soul. I have a framed copy of Caleb's photograph on my nightstand. It's the only picture I have of him, the one from the courtroom. I look at it every day. I tell him good morning and I tell him good night. I tell him about my day. I tell him that I love him. I am in my own quiet way, finally getting to be his mother. The grief for him will never go away. It has become a part of me, a shadow that walks beside me. But it is no longer an all-consuming darkness. Sometimes it is even a source of strength. It reminds me of what is real, of what is important. It reminds me of the devastating cost of lies. I don't know if I will ever trust anyone fully again. I don't know if I will ever remarry or have more children. The future is not a bright, shining path anymore. It is a quiet, winding road, and I am taking it one step at a time. I have survived the unimaginable. I have walked through the fire of the ugliest of truths and come out on the other side. I am scarred. I am changed. But I am still here. And in the quiet of my new life, for the first time in a very long time, that feels like enough. The story of Amelia and Michael is a harrowing reminder that sometimes the most devastating monsters are the ones sleeping right beside us, hidden behind a mask of love and concern. It's a story about the corrosive power of lies and the unimaginable depths of betrayal. But it's also a story of survival of a woman who walked through an inferno of public humiliation and private agony to reclaim her own truth and find a way to honor the son who was stolen from her twice. If this story touched you, if it made you think, if it made you feel, please take a moment to hit that like button to help us share it with more people. More importantly, leave a comment below. What part of Amelia's story resonated with you the most? And don't forget to subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell so you never miss another story that peels back the layers of the human experience and reveals the truth, no matter how shocking it might be. Thank you for listening.